Every now and then I'm asked to comment on the relative merits of residential real estate versus commercial real estate. And to me, I've operated in both. Like many people, I got started in residential real estate. Now, some people stay there. They never get out of the residential realm. Whereas I have tended to make a transition into commercial. I generally think commercial is much better. I've been operating in the commercial real estate for some 30 years now. And even I sometimes forget exactly why it is that good until I do things to remind myself of why I love it so much. So what I want to share with you today is just some of the reasons why I think commercial real estate is so incredibly good, in the hope that it might inspire you to at least consider commercial real estate. If you're in real estate anyway, and you're not sure if you want to make the transition from residential to commercial, that's right. I still think that by being in real estate, you're in a much better investment sector than just about any other investment you could choose to get into. I think real estate in general, residential or commercial or industrial, hospitality specialist, you name it, I think it is literally orders of magnitude better than any other investment. I know that of itself is a challenge for many people to get their head around that. I know many people will think, well, maybe you should do a podcast on that. Maybe I will. In fact, that's a good idea. But it is a lot better. People don't compare apples with apples when they make the comparison. They say, well, the stock market last year went up, say, 8%, and real estate only went up 7%. So how can you say that real estate is better? And one simple answer, I've got many, I'll do a whole podcast on it, I guess, at some stage. But one simple answer is that in general, if you want $100,000 invested in the stock market, then you have to have 100,000 of cash that you literally put into the stock market. Whereas that same 100,000 of cash can buy you $1 million property with a 90% mortgage. So, okay, let's say your shares go up or stock goes up by 8%. It goes from 100,000 to 108,000. And your real estate only went up by 7%, but it was 7% of that 1 million, which is 70,000. So it went up by 70,000. Your stock only went up by 8,000. And yet these pundits will still tell you that the stock market is better. And I know that's not the end of the story. There are all kinds of nuances, but I've done this analysis many times over, and I think it's not even the paper analysis or the mathematical equation you'd come up with to prove it one way or another. It's the result of people making investments. And I can tell you this, in general, people who invest in real estate tend to have only one regret, and that is that they didn't buy more real estate, be it residential or commercial. But that's not the topic for today. Today, we're going to talk about why I think commercial has so many astounding advantages over residential real estate. And so before we get started, I just want to clarify one thing, and that is talk about what is the difference between commercial real estate and residential real estate. And the reason, it seems pretty obvious when you just mention the words, but the reason I bring it up is for many people, the concept of an apartment building, whether it's an 8-plex or 200 units in an apartment, they consider that to be commercial. And in fact, for mortgaging purposes and insurancing purposes and financing purposes, it is considered commercial. Whereas I want to have a different definition of residential versus commercial. I know this seems like extraordinarily complex, but bear with me. In my world, the definition of residential property is property where people have residences. And commercial property is property where people conduct commerce. Now, I know that there's that small anomaly of people who are conducting commerce in their homes. We won't go into that. We'll put that aside for the moment. But in general, commerce is where people have commercial leases. They conduct a commercial operation. So on that basis, I think you'll agree that an apartment building is where people have residences. It might be large-scale residential, but in my books, it's still residential. You still have a residential tenancy agreement as opposed to a full commercial lease agreement. You still have to be bound by the rules and regulations that most jurisdictions impose on the renting out of residential space, whereas when it comes to the renting out of commercial space, they don't have any similar or analogous rules and regulations. So let's just agree on that definition, that residential property is where people have residences, commercial property is where people conduct commerce. So let's get into some of the differences. And well, actually, before we do that, one more thing, because this is kind of really important. And that is that in general, residential real estate is a people-centric operation. I know there are contracts involved. There's the residential tenancy agreement, and there's the lead-based paint disclosure document that you have to show people if the house is from pre-1978, at least in some jurisdictions in the States. So I know there are documents involved, but in essence, you're dealing with people. And you'll get a tenant calling you saying, my toilet is blocked. And you're saying, that's the third time this month. What are you putting down there? And they say, none of your stinking business, get it fixed. So you're then left to call the plumber, and you do call the plumber, and the plumber says, well, how about tomorrow at 4 p.m.? So you call the tenant and say, how about tomorrow at 4 p.m.? And they say, no, that doesn't suit us. How about Thursday at 10 a.m.? And you call the plumber, and you're dealing with people. Now, I know some of you are saying, Dolf, have you never heard of a property manager? Of course I have. And many of my residential properties that I still have left in my portfolio are managed by property managers. But you have to manage the property managers who manage the properties, if you get my drift. So it's still a people-centric operation. And all these vagaries and differences of opinion as to what constitutes cleanliness and what's the premise handed back in the same condition as it was when they got it, and what constitutes a blocked toilet, and are they responsible for it? It's a difference of opinion. You're dealing with people. Whereas with commercial real estate, I know there are people involved. The tenants are people. The leasing agent is a person. But in general, you're dealing with contracts. You've got a very detailed and specific commercial lease document, and it delineates just about every aspect of how that property will be leased. So I just want to make the observation in general that when it comes to residential real estate, you are essentially dealing with a lot of people. Whereas when it comes to commercial real estate, you're essentially dealing with contracts. And to me, they're more black and white, to put it that way. It's easier to figure out if there is an opinion that is straying from reality or not. I think you get the drift. So let's get into it. Some of the advantages in my mind, in my world, of commercial real estate over residential real estate. And the first one absolutely has to do with lease length. Typically for me, with a residential property, my residential tenants sign up under a residential tenancy agreement contract for a 1-year lease. Occasionally it's 2 years, but I've never had a tenant ask for 5 years or 10 years, never. And usually at the end of the first year, it's typical for that lease to be renewed for another year, but oftentimes they're not. And when it's not renewed, then the conditions of the lease are still valid, but it goes to an automatic month by month. And that is when I talk with other residential real estate investors, that is a typical scenario that, yes, they set them up on a 1-year rental agreement, but that's long since expired, and now it's just month to month, and they keep on paying, and everyone's happy until they leave, of course. Whereas with commercial real estate, admittedly, leases are getting a bit shorter these days. There was a time when 10-year leases were common. There was a time where in the city of London, that's not Greater London, but there's a portion of London known as the City of London, delineated by specific streets, and where typical lease lengths were 25 years. Because the big firms, the big boys, the financial institutions and the banks, they knew they wanted to be there for the long time. So anyway, they were 25-year leases. That's not so common, but a 6-year lease, an 8-year lease, 8 plus 8 or 8 plus 4 plus 4. What do we mean by plus? That's the initial lease term with a right of renewal. So I've got a lease in this building, for instance, it's 4 years with 2 rights of renewal of 2 years each. That means at the end of the initial 4-year period, the tenant, and it's exclusively the tenant who has the right to exercise this option, they have the right to say, we like it here, we want to extend for another 2 years. And at the end of that 2 years, because it was 2 plus 2, they can extend it again. Now, at the end of that period, in other words, a total of 8 years, the lease will have come to what they call its final termination. And so then you can negotiate a new lease if you like. But it means that when the tenant signs a 4 plus 2 plus 2 year lease, they have the right to be there for 8 years, essentially. In general, leases tend to be longer on commercial premises than on residential premises. And that suits everyone. And as I always say, the most frequent call I get from my commercial tenants is, Dolf, can I please get an extension on the lease? So I had it the other day where a tenant called me and said, Dolf, can I please get a 5-year extension on the lease? And I looked it up and I said, but you've still got 3 years left to run on the lease. And a typical response is, as happened in this case, yeah. Anyway, getting back to the question, can I please get a 5-year extension on the lease? It's as if when you tell them they still have 3 years to run, that's of no consequence to them. They're not interested in hearing that or knowing that. They want to know whether they can get an extension. So I have a question for you. Why, when a tenant still has 3 years left to run on the lease, why would they want to get a 5-year extension? And to understand the answer, you have to understand the concept of goodwill. Goodwill is something that a commercial tenants build up when their clients or patients or whomever they deal with know where the premises are. In other words, when they want to go to the grocery store or the doctor or the seamstress or bag repair shop, they don't even know the name of it. They certainly don't know the street address. If they know the street name, they don't know the street number, but they know where to drive. They know where to turn off to park. It's the image that the clients have built up in their mind as to where it is. So if the tenant moves every 12 months, they're going to lose half their client base because the clients won't know where to drive anymore. They'll drive and say, oh, they're gone. Let's look up another seamstress or another bag repair shop or whatever it is I mentioned before. And they'll look it up on Google and they'll find the next nearest one. They won't necessarily go back to the original one. So that's part of the concept of goodwill. It's that these tenants know that part of the value of their business is in being in a fixed location. Now, this may be of less consequence to those people who do everything online, but we're not talking about tenants who are online because they're not after the space we have. Am I worried with the commercial space they've got because people are going online more? No, there's a growing population. There's a growing number of businesses. The average space leased by some companies is going down. I think we're going to see more splitting of large premises into smaller premises than we're going to see consolidation of small premises into large premises. But even so, there's still a demand for all this commercial space. So I'm not at all worried about that, not for one moment. So there you have it, where tenants tend to want to extend their leases because of this goodwill factor. And that's great because it means that you have a lower turnover of tenants. So on average, and I measure the average length of time that my tenants stay, and I've engineered things, or maybe I'm just lucky, but I think engineering comes into it or doing it on purpose. And that is that my tenants tend to stay an extraordinarily long time. The average duration of my residential tenants is over 6 years, but the average duration of my commercial tenants is 11 years. And this is not something that is just luck. I mean, there might be an element of luck that I just happen to have buildings that happen to be occupied by people who ended up staying a long time. That could be an element of chance. But I think for the most part is too, I have moved with the times. I have modified the premises to suit them in an ongoing manner, and I've accommodated them. And this building that I'm in right now, for instance, we have different suite sizes. And as tenants have grown or shrunk, in terms of their business, of course, then we've managed to accommodate them and move them around. In fact, I and my staff have moved premises often. We've gone from this suite to that suite because a tenant happened to want the suite we were in based on its size, or whether it's on the ground floor, an upper floor, or whatever. And it's just a natural thing to do to accommodate that. Whereas if I'd been more, how can I put it? If I'd been more set in my ways and said, no, I own the building, I'm going to stay here, stuff you, then I possibly would have lost a few more tenants. Anyway, be that all as it may, we've got an extraordinarily long average length of stay of our tenants. But the thing I like about commercial real estate in general is that leases tend to be longer than on residential properties, which means you have a lower turnover of tenant. That just makes it easier to manage. It means you can focus on buying the next building instead of looking after your existing tenants. So that's point number one. Let's talk about point number two, which I would refer to as the assignment of lease. And to understand this, let's talk about a residential property that you might have. And let's say that you've got a tenant, they've signed up for a year and they're 5 months into the year, and they come to you and say, listen, we lost our job and my husband or my wife got another job offer in a city 2 states over, and we want to do that, but we're stuck with this lease. And technically they're stuck with it, right? They'll have to pay it out for the remaining 7 months of their 12-month tenancy agreement. But imagine they come to you and say, but listen, we've got friends, Sally and Tony Harrington, whatever the name is, and they really are looking for a place and they're willing to take over our lease. Will you allow them to take over the lease? Well, you'd have to be a pretty mean person to say no. And apart from that, assuming they're an equally qualified tenant, the new incoming couple, then I couldn't imagine a reason why you would turn them down and why you would say no. I can personally see no disadvantage of the substitute tenant over the original one. But now I want to present a scenario to you. It's a bit of a contrived scenario. Let's say 3 months after these new replacement tenants have taken over, let's say they fail to pay the rent. Do you think that legally you can go back to the previous tenants who've moved 2 states over and say, hey, your buddies never paid, you have to pay the rent? And normally you won't be able to do that. However, when it comes to commercial real estate, when a business sells, there is a document known as the assignment of lease. And this is an agreement between the seller, the outgoing tenant, the seller of the business, and the purchaser of the business, who's going to be your new tenant, and the landlord, that's you. It's called an assignment of lease document, whereby everyone agrees that the business is being sold to the incoming tenant. The incoming tenant is going to take over the lease under the same terms and conditions as existed before. However, should the incoming tenant fail to pay the rent, then you, the landlord, can go back to the previous tenant and get them to pay. And you might say, well, that seems a bit unfair. If it's not allowed in the residential world, why would it be allowed in the commercial world? Well, part of the reason is you want to avoid a mechanism whereby an existing tenant with 9 years to run on a 15-year lease, for instance, can wriggle out of the lease by selling their business for $1 to some bum on the street who's got no money to his name. You have no say in the matter. The business is sold. The bum can't even pay 1 minute's rent, let alone 1 month's rent. And so he goes bankrupt and the original tenant is out of the lease. Now, usually, probably the outgoing tenant wouldn't want to sell their business to someone with no money because then they'd get no money for it. But if they were sneakily trying to get out of the lease, that is a mechanism that they could use, and this prevents that. And so what you've got is you've got the incoming tenant who usually wants to run the business for a profit because they're going to feed their family from the profits of this business. They have a vested interest in making that business run properly, which means they'll pay all the bills, including the rent. And on the off chance that that fails, you can still go back to the original tenant. Now, these can stack up. I had a business, I don't know what you think of it. Down under, these are perhaps slightly more common than they are here, although we have less fast food in general down there. It's all changing. And that is, it was a fish and chip shop. Very common thing in many parts of the world. And in a 2-year period, it was a mere 2 years, the business sold 5 times. And interestingly, every time it sold, the sale price was higher and higher. So everyone made a capital gain out of it when they sold it. And they also obviously made some profit for the short duration that they all owned it. But because there were 5 sales in a 2-year period, all under the auspices of a single lease, it means I literally had 6 people lined up, one after the other, to pay the rent. The current tenant would pay it. If he failed to pay, the one before him would, the one before that, right back to the original tenant. And it goes without saying that I never missed a day of rent, of course. In fact, I seldom miss a day of rent on commercial premises anyway, because people tend to earn their income there. Anyway, that's an interesting point about the assignment of lease. Let's talk about improvements that are being made to a residential property. I've owned a number of residential properties, of course, over the years. I can't think of a single instance where a tenant called me and asked if they had my permission to make some improvement, to paint it, or to build an extension on, or to turn a carport into a garage, or anything like that. Never. And certainly there wasn't a case where they didn't call me and did it anyway. Whereas with commercial premises, there is a clause in the lease where prior to making any improvements or renovations, the tenant needs to seek the approval of the landlord. And I'm telling you, I often get calls from them saying, listen, we're thinking of doing this, we're thinking of expanding that. We want to replace a wall with a big glass curtain so that people can see in from outside. They need your permission, so they do this. Why do my commercial tenants tend to do this? In other words, spend money on my building using their own money. They'll improve my building, and residential tenants don't. It's just not done in residential. It is what it is. You live there. If you don't like it, you move out to something else. Whereas with commercial, again, they've got that goodwill built up. They want to stay there. And by being there, they still want to make the premises better. So they will ask your permission to spend their money improving your place. It increases the value of your property. It increases your equity. It increases your collateral. And it increases tenant appreciation. So hold that thought because, as they say in the infomercial, it gets even better. Wait, there's more. There's also a clause in these commercial leases, typical commercial leases all over the world, that the tenant has the right to request that the landlord will pay for an improvement. And you might say, well, Dolf, that kind of negates what you're saying because now, of course, they'll want to turn a half-story shack into a 12-story beautiful skyscraper. So they have the right to ask you to pay for it. But that same paragraph has the clause that says, should the landlord agree, then extra rent will be paid in the form of X% of the cost of the improvement. Why do I say X and not name a figure? Because the number that's put in there depends on prevailing economic conditions when the lease is signed. I've had economic conditions when interest rates were 16%. For some of you, that'll be hard to imagine. And did I ever have a mortgage with 16% interest rate? Yes, I did. I had mortgages at higher than that, and I happily paid them. Times have changed. Right now, mortgage interest rates are very low. So now the improvements percentage, the extra that a tenant will have to pay as a proportion of the cost of making a requested improvement, will be a lot less than it used to be then. But anyway, that's specified. So I can give you a practical example. I had a tenant, they operated a 24-hour convenience store. And there was a relatively small front door, just a single width front door and a relatively small window. It was quite wide, but it wasn't very tall. And at night, you couldn't see much light coming out of this. And they called me under the conditions of this clause in the lease. And they said, Dolf, would it be possible to tear down the front wall and replace it with one big glass wall? So glass everywhere at night. When you drive by, you can see all the activity inside, all the lights will be on inside. And I said, yeah, sure, you want to do that? You have my permission to do that. I'm thinking, great, they're improving my building, right? And then they said, okay, well, would you mind paying for it? And at this point, I felt inspired to ask what they thought it would cost. And they said, well, they've had the architects in, they've had a quote on it, and the quote came in at around $100,000. Would you be willing to pay for it? Now, I don't know what your initial reaction is, or would have been, but in my case, that didn't faze me at all. I wanted to know if they were willing to pay the extra rental. And they were. And I think prevailing conditions then were that they paid an extra 8%. In other words, they'd pay me $8,000 extra a year in rent if I put in that $100,000 glass wall. So one of the first things you're probably asking yourselves is, so you spend $100,000 and you get $8,000 back. That's 8% return. That's not a bad return on an investment. And you'd be right. It's not bad. But it actually kind of gets better than that for the following reason. 8% is neither here nor there for me because I could deploy that same $100,000 as a down payment on another building. And if I got an 80% mortgage, I could buy a $500,000 building. Or if I got a 90% mortgage, maybe with an SBA loan, I could buy $1 million building. And I'd rather own another $1 million building than get an 8% return. But here's the deal. I could spend the $100,000 putting in this glass wall and then get the building appraised again. And you might think that by spending $100,000 on this building, the value would go up by exactly $100,000 because that's what you spent on it. But very often, when you spend money on a building, the value goes up by more than the cost of whatever you did. And that's exactly what happened in this case. By putting in that glass wall, yes, the cost was $100,000, but the value went up by $200,000. So at this stage, I could get a new appraisal, a new valuation, and go back to the bank and say, Mr. Bank Manager, I have a new appraisal based on this one modification alone, the new glass wall. The value has gone up by $200,000. Will you give me a modest 50% mortgage on that increase in value? Actually refinance the whole building, but based on $200,000 extra, same thing, right? And banks are in the game of lending you money. They want to lend money. So they said, as I expected them to, yes, of course. And the interest rate at the time was 6%, right? So I could collect an extra 8% on the 100,000 spent. And then it would cost me, if I borrowed the money, 6%. So I had to give 6,000 of that 8,000 to the bank. You might say, well, surely then your return's gone down. You're down to only 2,000. But remember, I was collecting $8,000 on $100,000 invested. But this way, I could collect only $2,000, but on zero money invested. It was all money from the bank. So you have a choice. Do you want to get an 8% return on your $100,000, or do you want to get a $2,000 return on none of your own money? That's an infinite return. And that's exactly what I did. So you've got to realize that with commercial real estate, suddenly the numbers change, the rules change, the game changes. And what was an unviable and unlikely thing to happen in the residential world, in the commercial world, this is not uncommon. So that's another advantage. Sometimes the tenants pay for the improvement. Sometimes they ask you to pay, but when you pay, they actually increase the rent. Here's another thought, another massive advantage of commercial real estate over residential. And that is that commercial tenants tend to earn their income on the premises, unlike residential tenants who just live there. And you might say, what's the significance of that difference? Well, because they earn their income there, because many of them have clients coming there, they have a vested interest in keeping the place looking good. They want it to be spick and span. They'll paint it every now and then. They'll remodel it. They'll be the ones replacing old incandescent bulbs with LED bulbs. They're the ones who are replacing the interior and the carpets or whatever because they want it to look good so that they get more clients and better quality clients. So that's a very interesting difference to me. Another difference is that they, because they tend to earn their income there and they have a vested interest in keeping the place looking good. They also want to make sure that any of their colleagues who come to see it see a great premise. So they're going to want to do things all the time to come up with a good impression of that building. Now, let's assume that someone leases their house that they live in, they rent it, and they lease their commercial premises. And business isn't going so well. So they can't really afford to pay the rent on both their house and their commercial premise, and they can only afford to pay the rent on one of them. The question becomes, which one are they going to pay? And I want to put it to you in the following way. For some reason, actually I know the reason, I'll explain the reason shortly, governments all over the world and in every jurisdiction, on a provincial level, on a state level, on a city level, they have got laws in place to protect the poor, suspecting, kind, sweet, innocent tenant. And I'm not fundamentally against these laws, but what it means is that if a tenant is late with the rent, you can't just put them out on the street straight away. In some places, it gets pretty ridiculous. Here in Arizona, you can issue a 5-day pay or quit notice. They've got 5 days to pay what's owing if they're genuinely behind in rent. And if they don't, you can't evict them that day. It's another 15-day process, but you go through the courts. And at the end of 15 days, if they haven't remedied the situation, you can turn up with what's known as the police constable here. It's a different concept from police constable in parts of the English world. But essentially, they get turfed out onto the street. And other parts of this country, like California, if a tenant is late with their rent, you can't begin to take action for at least 90 days. And if you think that is slanted in favor of the tenant and against the landlord, in the Netherlands, if a tenant manages to squat in a building, I guess they're not a tenant at that stage, if a squatter manages to squat in a building for 6 months, then they can start a legal proceeding to own the building. And you might ask yourself, why is it that all over the world, governments consistently support the tenant and not the landlord? Why is the tenant seen as a sweet, kind, innocent, unsuspecting, generous person, and the landlord is seen as the rapacious, racketeering, money-hungry grub? And I think the answer lies in the fact that there are simply numerically more tenant voters than landlord voters. If a politician goes up on a platform and says, why should we let these rapacious, racketeering landlords jack the rent up to whatever they see fit? It's unfair. You poor, kind, unsuspecting tenants, it's not your fault that you can't pay the rent. You lost your job, probably because a buddy of that rich landlord fired you unfairly. And they whip up this fever, and there are more tenant voters, as I said, than landlord voters. So it carries the day. That's what gets enacted. And this won't be the case every time, but I think there's an element of truth to that. So if a tenant can't pay all his rent on his home and his commercial premises, chances are he's going to pay the rent on the commercial premises. Why? Because if he doesn't pay it on his house, there's little that can be done to him for at least a few months. Whereas the government all over the world doesn't tend to take such an involved attitude with commercial leases. It's whatever flies in the real world. So most commercial leases state that rent is due on the 1st of the month. Usually they give you a grace into the 3rd, because what if the 1st is a Saturday and Monday's a public holiday, or that sort of thing. But then if it's not paid within a certain number of days, penalty interest will accrue, and there'll be a penalty. And if you don't pay within a certain time frame under that, the landlord can seize the premises. He can't seize your staff inside there. That would be called kidnapping or restraining against people's will. But he can seize the premises, including your plant, stock, and equipment. And then if you still don't pay, he can do things to sell those and retrieve his money or get recouped for what you owe him. And you can't do that with residential. So in general, there are all these advantages of commercial real estate over residential real estate. And I know you must be wondering, well, surely, Dolf, there've got to be a few disadvantages of commercial real estate over residential. And I see that yet again, we have run out of time. So next time, I'm going to pick up the thread and continue and explain the disadvantages of commercial real estate over residential. And then, as I am wont to do, I'm going to come up with a supposition. What if we can turn the disadvantages of commercial into advantages? Because if we can do that, then surely you'd have to agree that there are some pretty compelling reasons why, at the very least, you should consider investing in commercial real estate. So thank you for attention. Next time, we're going to talk about the disadvantages of commercial and then how we can turn them around into being advantages. Thank you for being here. And until next time, I want to wish you, as always, successful investing.